Phase 3, Chapter 46. After a decent interval, Queen Tilly acquired another Chihuahua. Max insisted on it. He couldn't stand when she blubbered during dog food commercials, and the little urn of ashes was giving him the creeps. One day, he simply blew out the black candles and drove her to a pet store. An outlaw lover is not so easily replaced. Cherie refused to see Aben Faisal. She refused to see the reporters who telephoned daily. The reporters didn't want to ask her about the woodpecker. Her relationship with him was still secret from the public. The reporters wanted to talk about the monarchy of Mu. 2 days following Bernard's arrest, People magazine hit the stands with its article on her. It seemed the press thought Mu was a good idea. Several deposed royals who'd been interviewed thought it was a good idea. Even King Max, who'd never had the slightest interest in natural environment beyond the blackberries that drummed their million menacing fingernails outside his walls, thought it was a good idea. Max encouraged her to follow through. He encouraged her to see the reporters. He encouraged her to see Aben Faisal, but Cherie would see no one. She wished only to see Bernard. And so far, the King County Jail, where he was being held while he was awaiting trial, had refused to allow him visitors. He was not allowed bail either. If he had been, Cherie would have hocked what was left of Tilly's crown jewels to go it. The Furstenberg Barcelona Code could take a flying fuck at a rolling tiara. The most important thing is love, said Cherie. I know that now. There's no point in saving the world if it means losing the moon. Cherie sent that message to Bernard through his attorney. The message continued. I'm not quite 20, but thanks to you I've learned something that many women these days never learn. Prince Charming really is a toad. And the beautiful princess has halitosis. The bottom line is that A, people are never perfect, but love can be. B, that is the one and only way that the mediocre and the vile can be transformed. And C, doing that makes it that. Loving makes love. Loving makes itself. We waste time looking for the perfect lover instead of creating the perfect love. Wouldn't that be the way to make love stay? The next day, Bernard's attorney delivered to her this reply. Love is the ultimate outlaw. It just won't adhere to any rules. The most any of us can do is to sign on as its accomplice. Instead of vowing to honor and obey, maybe we should swear to aid and abet. That would mean that security is out of the question. The words make and stay become inappropriate. My love for you has no strings attached. I love you for free. Cherie went out in the blackberries and wept. I'll follow him to the ends of the earth, she sobbed. Yes, darling, but the earth doesn't have any ends. Columbus fixed that. Chapter 47. Blackberries. Nothing, not mushrooms, not ferns, not moss, not melancholy. Nothing grew more vigorously, more intractably in the Puget Sound rains than blackberries. Farmers had to bulldoze them out of their fields. Homeowners dug and chopped, and still they came back. Park attendants with flamethrowers held them off at the gates. Even downtown, a loft left unattended for a season would be overgrown. In the wet months, blackberries spread so wildly, so rapidly that dogs and small children were sometimes engulfed and never heard from again. In the peak of the season, even adults dared not go berry picking without a military escort. Blackberry vines pushed up through the solid concrete, forced their way into polite society, entwined the legs of virgins, and tried to loop themselves over passing clouds. The aggression, speed, roughness, and nervy upward mobility of blackberries symbolized for Max and Tilly everything they disliked about America, especially its frontier. Bernard Mickey Wrangle took a yum approach. To the king, during tea, Bernard advocated the planting of blackberries on every building top in Seattle. They would require no care aside from encouraging them arbor-like to crisscross the streets, roof to roof, to arch, forming canopies, natural arcades, as it were. In no time at all, people could walk through the city in the downpouringest of winter and feel not a splat. Every shopper, every theater goer, every cop on the beat, every snoozing bum would be snug and dry. The pale green illumination that filtered through the dome of vines could inspire a whole new school of painting. Centuries from now, art critics might speak of chiaroscuro, of blackberry light. The vines would attract birds. Woodpeckers might not bother, but many birds would. The birds would sing. A bird full of berry pulp is like an Italian full of pathos. Small animals might move into the arches. Look, Billy, up there, over the dental building, a badger. And the fruit, mustn't forget the fruit. It would nourish the hungry, stabilize the poor. The more enterprising winos could distill their own spirits. Seattle could become the blackberry brandy capital of the world. Tourists would spend millions annually on Seattle blackberry pies, and the discerning toast of the nation would demand to spread with Seattle blackberry jam. The chefs at the French restaurants would dish up duck in purple sauces, fill once rained-on noses with the baking aromas of Gâteau Murray de Rancé. The whores might become known, affectionately, as blackberry tarts. The teamsters could try to organize the berry pickers, and in late summer, when the brambles were proliferating madly, growing faster than the human eye can see, the energy of their furious growth could be hooked up to generators that, spinning with blackberry power, could supply electrical current for the entire metropolis. A vegetative utopia, that's what it would be. Seattle, Berrytown, encapsulated, self-sufficient, thriving under a living ceiling, blossoms in its hair, juice on its chin, more blackberries and more in its future. Consider the protection offered. What enemy paratroopers could get through the briars? The king's heart had rattled like spook chains in a horror show. Trembling, he had changed the subject to basketball. "Oh, spaghetti-o," muddied Tilly under her breath. Had the ink remained upright in its bottle, had the carpet's innocence been preserved, it was still doubtful if Bernard would have been invited back to the palace. Now, following Chihuahua slaughter and publicized arrest, it was futile for Lee Cherie to expect sympathy from her parents, let alone help. She wept against Julietta's brick-like breasts. And when the tear barrel was finally empty and every available frog had been consulted, she made up, dressed up, and caught a bus into town. She was going to keep an appointment with Bernard's attorney. She was embracing the blackberry as her emblem, her symbol, her exemplar, her muse. In other words, she would persist to the wildest lengths of persistence. She was going to blackberry her way to her man. My kind of girl. Chapter 48. The suburban bus let her off on First Avenue, a street as old as the city itself, though far younger than the tawdry commerce that for many Seattleites the very name of the street implied. A slim, steady rain was falling. Neon reflections on the wet concrete gave First Avenue the appearance of an underwater burial ground for parrots. As Lee Cherie walked south, the mood of the avenue grew increasingly rowdy. Mouthholes of saxophones and pistols gaped at her from pawnshop windows. Quote, adult bookstores and porno cinemas promised further gapings. Smells of stale hot dogs and soaked mackinaws wafted by on zephyrs of exhaust. If she had drunk just one beer in each of the taverns she passed, she could have consumed a case in a very few blocks. But though beer, in its foamy neutrality, may have been the perfect beverage for the last quarter of the 20th century, Lee Cherie did not drink beer, and wouldn't have drunk it in the Born to Lose Tavern, the Broken Jaw Tavern, or the Sailors Have More Fun Tavern, if she did. Passing a tattoo parlor, she paused to window shop the mermaids, screaming eagles and macabre tributes to Mom. Through the raindrops that streaked the plate glass, she saw that phrase again, Born to Lose. This time on the tattoo artist's flashcard, Born to Lose, a slogan so expressive, so deeply relevant that men have it permanently etched into their hides. And she thought of her own flaccid biceps, imagining the slogan stenciled there. She wondered if one lost one's royal privilege if one had one's royal epidermis inscribed. She did know that once tattooed, one could no longer expect to lie for all eternity in an Orthodox Jewish cemetery. They wouldn't even bury women with pierced ears. A strange theory of mutilation from the people who invented cutting the skin off of the pee-pee. The princess walked on. She met sailors who hunkered. Period. She met lumberjacks who cursed. She met the original cast of the Food Stamp Opera, who tried to lure her up to their $3 hotel rooms where the light bulbs were dying and the wallpaper was already dead. She met many winos. They were at various stages of wino development. Invariably, however, they seemed to have made peace with the rain, as if the wino ambassador had negotiated a treaty with the rulers of rain, a compromise henceforth known as the Tokay Accords. The Indian winos, in particular, were unhurried by the weather, and she recalled that Bernard had said, "White men watch clocks, but the clocks are watching the Indians." The princess was wearing a yellow vinyl slicker with matching hat. It looked great with her red hair. She walked on. There was some good news. Jablonski, whose features were so strong that no amount of freckles could burden them, had been successful in her petition to have Bernard's rights to be visited restored. Lee Cherie could go see him on the following Sunday, 3 days away. "There are conditions, however," said Jablonski, handing the princess a tissue to mop up her happy tears. "Conditions set not by the court, but by Mr. Wrangel and me." "Like what?" asked Lee Cherie. "My dear, you must realize that your conversation will be bugged. For some reason, Mr. Wrangel is suspected of being involved in an international plot to return your father to the throne. Anything you might say regarding your family, or, for that matter, your personal relationship with Mr. Wrangel, might be construed in such a manner as to deepen those suspicions, which would hurt our chances for a minimal sentence. I wanted to establish some safe guidelines for your conversation. Mr. Wrangel went one step further. He doesn't feel it would be emotionally beneficial for either of you to converse at all. He feels that poignant dialogue will merely make your separation all the more difficult, and he certainly doesn't believe the CIA should be privy to the private tenderness you share. He does very much want to see you, and he longs to hear your voice, but he desires that nothing in the way of personal conversation pass between you." "But what'll I do? I can't just sit there and talk about the rain on the fucking blackberries. What'll I say?" Tears of joy, exit stage right. Tears of bewilderment, enter stage left. Advance to footlights. "Mr. Wrangel suggests that you tell him a story." "What? A story?" "Yes, a story of some sort. He wishes to look at you. He wishes to hear you speak. You'll have 10 minutes. Just tell him a story. I'm sure you'll think of something." Lee Cherie stared at the anti-nuclear posters on the office wall. Nuclear power was one of the most sinister frauds ever perpetrated on the American people, and yet its implications meant little to her now. Mrs. Jablonski removed her fashionably large spectacles and stood. "I asked Mr. Wrangel what you were like. He said you were hornet juice and rosebuds in a container of gazelle meat. He does speak colorfully, doesn't he?" Lee Cherie pulled up on her dripping slicker and departed. As she sped back up First Avenue in a taxi, she was not in the mood for any more Born to Lose, she thought. A story? I do know one story. I know one story it'll have to do. Chapter 49.